Every morning at 7:03 sharp, a small boy stood in front of Bell's bakery. He wasn't there to buy anything. He never stepped inside, never even touched the door. But he watched, always watching. His coat was too thin for the chill in the air, the sleeves frayed where little hands had pushed too far through. He stood close enough to the glass to see the warm light spilling from inside, but never close enough to fog it up with his breath. Inside, Margaret Bell, owner and baker, kneaded her dough with steady hands. She had noticed him weeks ago, the way you notice the sun rising a little earlier, a little colder. He was just a shadow at first, a presence you assume will fade. But he didn't fade. He became part of her mornings as surely as the smell of cinnamon and the hiss of the espresso machine. Customers came and went, chatting with each other or scrolling through phones, oblivious to the boy beyond the glass. He didn't stare with desperation. There was something else in his gaze, something steadier, sadder, older than his years. He watched the pastries with quiet longing, but more often he watched people, studied them, almost like he was memorizing a language he hadn't learned to speak. Margaret told herself not to think too much about it. Kids hung around storefronts sometimes. Maybe he liked the smell. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe her mind reached for reasons, soft justifications, but none of them felt quite right. Because he was there even on the mornings when the wind blew hard enough to rattle the sign above the door. Even when the roads shimmered with frost and most kids stayed curled up in warm beds. Still, he never knocked, never begged. Just stood there, eyes fixed through the glass, as though watching something he once knew but had lost along the way. That morning, like all the others, Margaret looked up from the register, just in time to see him step back from the window as a customer passed. He always did that, shrinking into the background, invisible again. And then, as always, he turned and walked away. Just before the church bells rang 8, Margaret stood for a long moment, holding a tray of croissants that suddenly felt heavier than usual. She wasn't sure when her curiosity had become concern, but she knew this much. Tomorrow, when the boy came again, she would be ready. Margaret had seen many faces through her bakery window. Children with sticky fingers pressed against the glass, teenagers scrolling on their phones, elderly couples with eyes that still lit up at the scent of cinnamon buns. But none of them looked like this boy. His eyes didn't roam like most children's did. They fixed, quiet, intense, on the trays of bread, the rows of muffins, the rotating display of tarts. And when they lifted to meet hers for the first time, something in Margaret stalled. They were the kind of eyes that didn't belong to a boy so young, pale, washed out, too still. Not blank, not dull, no, worse. They were alert, observing, enduring, as if he'd spent too long watching the world move around him without ever being allowed to join it. Margaret tried to shake it off. She had loaves to shape, receipts to total, 1,000 little details that demanded her attention. But each morning, the boy returned, and each morning, those eyes greeted her from just beyond the glass, not asking, not pleading, just waiting. She began noticing things she hadn't before. The way his hands stayed buried deep in his coat pockets, even when the sun began to rise warmer. The way his shoulders hunched, not from cold, but as if bracing against something invisible. He never fidgeted, never paced. He stood like someone used to holding still, to being unnoticed. But Margaret noticed. It was the stillness that got to her. Children were supposed to buzz with restlessness, wiggle in their sneakers, laugh too loudly, and reach for cookies they weren't allowed to have. This boy was a statue, a whisper of something heavy carried in silence. One day, while wiping the inside of the glass door, she caught his gaze again. She didn't flinch this time. She met it. held it, and for just a moment, she saw the faintest shift, a flicker, like winter light catching on a frozen lake. Not warmth exactly, but the memory of it. Then, as always, the moment broke. A car passed, a dog barked, and he turned, disappearing down the sidewalk without a word, leaving Margaret with her rag in hand and a heart that somehow felt heavier than it had that morning. The boy had eyes like winter, not cruel, not empty, just cold from too many seasons of waiting. He never asked for anything, never knocked, never even looked like he might cross the threshold. But sometimes Margaret would catch him crouched near the bench just outside the bakery window, fingertips grazing the pavement, collecting crumbs. They weren't deliberate offerings, just stray flakes of croissant, tiny shards of crust left behind by the morning rush. Most people wouldn't even notice them, swept away by the wind or a careless boot. But the boy did. He moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much could be gathered, how long it would last, and how invisible he had to remain while doing it. Margaret watched once from behind the espresso machine. His fingers were quick, darting out to pinch a few crumbs, then pulling them back into his coat. He didn't eat them right away. Sometimes he rolled them between his fingers like they were coins, like he was calculating something important. And always, he kept one eye on the window, not to see if someone would stop him. No, it wasn't fear of being caught. It was something deeper, a readiness to run, a learned instinct that told him kindness usually came with questions. And questions were dangerous. That morning, Margaret walked outside under the pretense of sweeping the stoop. The boy stood quickly when he saw her, brushing his hands on his coat. He didn't meet her eyes. Not today. "Cold morning," she said casually, her broom scratching across the concrete. "Supposed to snow later." He nodded once, tight, brief, then took a step back, the message clear. Distance. Margaret didn't press. She just swept the crumbs into a neat pile, paused, and let the wind catch a few, scattering them just enough that he could still claim them without shame. Then she turned and walked back inside. From behind the counter, she watched him return. He crouched again, gathered what the wind had spared. And for a heartbeat, no more than that, he looked up at her through the glass. Not long enough to be called a stare, just a glance. But it was different this time. There was a flicker of something like trust. Then he was gone, crumbs and all, vanishing into the morning like a boy made of fog. Margaret didn't know his name, but she knew hunger when she saw it, and not the kind bread alone could cure. Margaret had flour on her sleeves again. It clung to her sweater like snowfall, soft and inevitable, no matter how many aprons she wore. She wiped her hands on a towel as she moved from the oven to the front counter, trays of sourdough and brioche cooling on the racks behind her. The bell above the bakery door jingled as another customer came in, bringing with them the chill of late November. She forced a smile. That was part of it, the performance. The warm lighting, the soft classical music playing low behind the hum of the espresso machine. Bell's Bakery was known for its charm, its familiarity. People came for comfort as much as for the bread. Margaret made sure they got both, which was why she told herself not to think about the boy. He was a shadow, a flicker in her peripheral vision each morning. She'd noticed him too many times now, lingering just outside the bakery, crouching for crumbs, vanishing before the hour struck 8. But there was no time to think about it. Not really. Running the place alone meant waking before dawn, baking until her knees ached, balancing orders and deliveries, handling every customer with a smile that didn't always feel honest. Her husband, Walter, had been the face, the charm, the jokes. Cancer had taken him 2 winters ago. Margaret hadn't stopped baking since. Not once. The boy outside was none of her business. That's what she repeated as she counted change, scribbled inventory lists, made polite conversation with a woman asking if the pecan rolls were gluten-free. She had a business to run, bills to pay, rent on the building and her apartment upstairs, licensing, inspections, and a temperamental oven that wheezed more than it should. There wasn't time to take in every stray with sad eyes and threadbare clothes. And yet, some mornings, she caught herself watching the sidewalk more than her oven timer, noticing how the boy's breath fogged in the cold, how he never wore gloves, how he always arrived alone and left without a sound. Margaret scolded herself for caring. "He's not your responsibility," she muttered, more to the bread dough than to herself. "You've got enough to deal with." But when the window fogged from the warmth inside and she saw his small figure beyond it, still, quiet, waiting, something inside her refused to harden. Even if she couldn't afford to help, some part of her couldn't bear to look away. They started talking around the fourth week. Not loudly, just soft comments passed over lattes and croissants in the hush between the morning rush and the late risers. Margaret heard them the way bakers hear everything in their shops, half listening while folding dough, reading lips between the clang of trays and the hiss of milk steaming. "Seen that boy again," murmured Mrs. Fletcher, the retired schoolteacher, to her bridge partner. "Every day now, just standing there." "Never buys anything," came the reply. "Odd, isn't it?" Margaret kept her back turned, slicing warm banana bread, but her ears were wide open. A pair of teenagers giggled near the scones. "Looks like a ghost. Kinda creepy, right? Maybe he's cursed or something." "Probably just homeless," their friend offered, more serious. And once, from the man who ran the dry cleaner down the block, she heard, "Where are his parents? A kid that age shouldn't be out alone like that." They didn't say it to her face, of course. No one accused Margaret of anything. But there was an expectation in their eyes when they looked at her now, as though she, the proprietor of the cozy neighborhood bakery, was supposed to have answers about the boy with the winter eyes. She didn't. Not yet. But the questions were growing louder, even when unspoken. Why did he never come inside? Why did he disappear so quickly the moment anyone approached? Why was he always alone? Margaret found herself asking those same things, not out of suspicion like the others, but out of a quiet ache she couldn't explain. She tried not to let it affect her work, kept her head down, focused on cinnamon knots and cardamom loaves. But every time the bell jingled and the door opened, part of her hoped it would be him. Walking in at last, asking for anything at all. He never did. Still, he stood outside most mornings, and the town kept whispering. But the boy said nothing, not with his mouth, only with his stillness, and his eyes that always seemed to be listening for something no one else could hear. The sky was still painted with the last strokes of dawn when Margaret unlocked the front door of Bell's Bakery. The smell of yeast and sugar greeted her like an old friend. She flipped on the lights, tied her apron, and began the daily rhythm, mixing, shaping, waiting. Outside, like clockwork, the boy appeared. She saw him from the corner of her eye as she placed a tray of cinnamon rolls in the display case. Same coat, same stillness, same spot by the bench. For weeks, he'd been part of the background, a shadow just beyond the reach of her warm interior world. He never made a sound, never begged, never even lingered long enough to be approached. But this morning felt different. Margaret didn't know why. Maybe it was the frost clinging more stubbornly to the glass, or the way the sunrise broke through the clouds, casting soft gold across the street. Or maybe it was simply the weight of too many questions building inside her. She looked up, and for the first time, so did he. Their eyes locked through the glass, just for a moment. Not long enough to share anything spoken, but enough for something unspoken to pass between them. His expression didn't change. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. But there was a flicker, something like recognition, or hesitation, or maybe just the softest echo of wanting to trust. Then he turned his head sharply, like he'd realized too late that he'd been seen. In an instant, he stepped back, then vanished down the sidewalk, swallowed by the city waking up. Margaret stood still, a half-frosted Danish in her hand. The bakery, usually her anchor, felt unsteady for a moment. That look, that brief connection, had cracked something. He wasn't just a boy watching pastries anymore. He was a child who had been seen, and who, for just a second, had looked back. That Friday, the boy came later than usual. It was nearly 8 when Margaret finally spotted him across the street, standing in the same place but shifting slightly from foot to foot. A nervous energy she hadn't seen before. Something was different. Urgent. And Margaret, who had spent weeks trying not to get involved, made a quiet decision. She pulled the closed sign across the bakery door an hour early. The regulars would forgive her. The bread would keep. Some things she had begun to realize couldn't be left to chance. By the time she untied her apron and stepped outside, the boy had already started walking away. Not fast, but with purpose. She followed from a distance, her coat clutched around her, heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. The morning was still, the streets only half awake. It made every sound, every scuff of her boots, every passing car, feel louder. He didn't look back. The boy moved like someone used to vanishing. He took turns without hesitation, slipping through narrow alleys and over cracked sidewalks, weaving a path that wasn't random. Margaret kept a careful pace, never getting too close, never letting him see her shadow. After 10 minutes, he crossed a street lined with shuttered storefronts and overgrown lots. Then he stopped at the edge of a sagging house, its porch stooped, its windows half-boarded. Margaret paused behind a broken fence, watching. He didn't knock. He just slipped through a narrow side door, disappearing into the quiet rot of the house. Margaret stood there for a long moment, breath clouding in the air. She could still walk away. Pretend she hadn't seen where he went. Pretend it wasn't her business. But she knew better now. The boy didn't need a sandwich or a coat. He needed someone to follow. He moved like someone who had been taught to disappear. The boy didn't walk down Main Street like most children might. Head high, careless in the way only the young can afford. No, his steps were calculated, chosen. Through alleys that smelled of rust and wet brick, down side streets lined with leaning fences and broken mailboxes. He took corners with quick glances over his shoulder, his eyes scanning for anyone who might be following. Margaret kept her distance. Far enough not to alarm him, close enough not to lose him. She didn't know what she expected to find. She only knew she couldn't stay behind that bakery window any longer, watching a child move like a ghost through her life. At one point, he paused behind an old brick building, crouching as if to tie his shoe. But Margaret saw it for what it was, a moment to listen, to breathe, to check. She pressed herself against a nearby fence, heart thudding in her chest. After a long breath, he moved again, cutting through a narrow gap between two houses. The path he followed wasn't convenient. It was careful, designed to avoid notice. And it worked, most of the time. But not today. Margaret trailed him for nearly 15 minutes, her shoes crunching quietly on gravel and frost-bitten leaves. As she turned the last corner and caught sight of the sagging house again, its shutters askew, roof pocked with patches, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. He slipped through the warped door like a shadow folding into itself. She stood there, frozen, the silence of the morning pressing in around her. The boy didn't just need food, he needed safety. And he had been navigating the world alone in a way no child ever should. Margaret wasn't sure what came next, but she knew the path now, and she wasn't going to let it end in silence. The house at the end of the boy's trail looked like it had been forgotten by time. Its roof sagged in the center, weighed down by years of neglect. One shutter hung crooked on a rusted hinge, the others nailed shut with splintered boards that didn't quite match the original frame. The yard was more dirt than grass, littered with broken toys that looked too faded to have belonged to any child recently. Margaret stopped on the sidewalk, just outside the overgrown walkway. Her breath caught. This was where he lived? The boy had already disappeared through a narrow gap in the side door, slipping inside like smoke. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate. It was a practiced move, quiet, familiar. The kind of entrance someone used when they didn't want anyone to know they were coming home. Margaret stood there for a long moment, staring at the house. It had the stillness of something brittle, as if one wrong noise might cause it to crumble in on itself. But there was life inside. She knew that now. A boy with two thin shoulders and eyes like winter. A boy who watched the world with the quiet fear of someone who had learned too early how quickly it could hurt him. She took a step closer, her boots crunching softly on broken bits of sidewalk. Through the gap in the boards, she glimpsed movement. A small shape crouched near a low cot. Another figure lay still beneath a threadbare blanket. The boy knelt beside them, one hand resting lightly on the woman's shoulder. His other hand moved to the old heater beside the bed, adjusting the knob with practiced care. Margaret's chest tightened. It wasn't just him. He wasn't alone in that crumbling house, but he was clearly the one holding it all together. She backed away slowly, careful not to be seen, heart pounding. She didn't know what she would do next, not exactly. But she knew this now with certainty. He needed more than scraps. He needed help. Quiet help. Gentle help. The kind that didn't ask too many questions. And if no one else was going to offer it, she would. Margaret hadn't meant to look. She'd only crept closer to be sure the boy had made it safely inside, to confirm, if only to herself, that he wasn't living in the ruin alone. But as she neared the boarded-up window, her hand braced lightly on the peeling frame. Her eyes caught a sliver of the inside through a jagged crack between two planks. It was dim. Dust hung in the air like slow-moving fog, catching the faint shafts of morning light. The wallpaper, what was left of it, peeled in great curls, exposing warped wood beneath. But her focus locked on the boy, kneeling beside a narrow cot tucked against the far wall. He was talking to someone, though no sound reached her. His hand moved carefully, brushing a strand of hair from the forehead of the woman lying there. She was impossibly still, her face pale, her frame skeletal beneath the threadbare blanket. A space heater hummed quietly nearby, its light flickering like a candle threatening to go out. Margaret watched, unmoving, breath held tight in her chest. The boy adjusted the blanket gently, checking the woman's wrist before reaching into a plastic bag beside the cot and pulling out a pill bottle. His fingers were precise, practiced. This wasn't new to him. He was caring for her, not just surviving, but taking responsibility. Quietly, invisibly. A child carrying the weight of an adult life. Margaret's throat tightened. Whatever story she'd begun to imagine about him, the crumbs, the silence, the vanishing, none of it prepared her for this truth. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He was rooted to something fragile, something he loved, and he was doing everything in his small power to keep it from breaking. She stepped back, suddenly aware of how wrong it felt to watch. It wasn't her place. Not yet. But as she turned to go, one final glance inside caught the boy looking directly at the gap in the boards. She froze. He didn't move, didn't shout, just stared at her, his face unreadable. And then, just for a second, he nodded. Not in fear, not in anger, in acceptance. As if he knew she'd follow, as if he'd been waiting for someone to see. Margaret didn't remember walking home. One moment she was standing in front of that broken house, the boy's solemn nod still lingering in her mind, and the next she was in her apartment above the bakery, kettle screaming on the stove, hands trembling as she reached to silence it. She poured the water, watched steam rise from the chipped mug, and sat at her small kitchen table, numb. Outside, the town moved on. Cars passed, dogs barked, children rushed to school with backpacks bouncing. But inside, everything was still. Heavy. She couldn't stop seeing the boy's fingers tucking the blanket tighter around that frail woman. Couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, not with fear, but with something deeper. Tired trust, a silent plea. He was alone in the way that cuts deeper than solitude. Alone with responsibility, with love that weighed more than his years should have to carry. She rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them. The tea sat untouched. What was she supposed to do? Call someone. Who? Social services. The police. That could break whatever fragile world he was holding together. The system didn't always understand quiet desperation. Sometimes it tore things apart trying to help. But doing nothing, could she live with that? Margaret stared at the wall where Walter's old coat still hung, the one he'd worn every Saturday to pick up flour from the market. He'd been the kind of man who fed stray dogs from his lunch and left extra firewood on the porches of neighbors too proud to ask. Do what you can, where you are, he used to say. Even small warmth is warmth. Her throat closed. She couldn't fix everything. She couldn't carry them out of that house or solve years of struggle with a single kind gesture. But she could do something. She stood up slowly, the decision settling in her bones like bread rising in a warm oven, gradual but steady. Tomorrow morning, the boy would be back outside the bakery, and this time he wouldn't leave empty-handed. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bakery before sunrise. She moved with quiet resolve, her hands steady even as her heart beat a little faster than usual. The dough was already proofing, the ovens humming low, casting a golden glow through the kitchen. Outside, the street was still asleep, washed in gray. She shaped the dough with care, not for the shelves, not for the regulars, but for someone who never crossed the threshold. A simple roll, soft and warm, brushed with butter and a pinch of sea salt. Not much, but more than crumbs. She placed it in a small brown paper bag and folded the top carefully. No note, no explanation. Just warmth, wrapped and waiting. At 7 o'clock she stepped outside and placed the bag on the bench where the boy always stood. No fanfare, no waiting. She returned inside, flipped the sign to open, and resumed the rhythm of her morning. The boy arrived as always, at exactly 7:03. She watched through the glass as he approached. He noticed the bag immediately. His steps slowed. He looked up at the bakery window, scanning it, though she made sure not to meet his gaze this time. This wasn't about gratitude or attention. It was about hunger. Quietly answered. He stood for a moment, uncertain. Then, with the care of someone handling something rare, he picked up the bag and sat down on the edge of the bench. He opened it slowly, as if unsure it was really for him. When he saw the roll, still steaming slightly, his shoulders dropped, just a little. He didn't devour it. He ate slowly in small bites, his eyes fixed on the pavement. When he finished, he folded the empty bag neatly and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then he stood, glanced once more at the bakery window, and walked away. Margaret stood still behind the counter, her hands resting on the cutting board, a faint tightness in her chest. It wasn't much, just a roll and butter, but it was the beginning of something. And sometimes, beginnings came in brown paper bags. The next morning, Margaret rose early again. She baked a fresh roll, this time with a touch of honey folded into the dough, and placed it gently into a paper bag while the bakery was still dark. She wrote nothing, still unsure if words would be welcome. Instead, she added a small pat of butter wrapped in wax paper, nestled beside the bread like a quiet offering. At 6:59, she stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold air, and placed the bag in the same spot on the bench. She didn't linger, just turned and went back inside, the door closing softly behind her. She didn't watch this time, not right away. Customers trickled in, the scent of cinnamon and espresso thick in the air. But somewhere between pulling a tray of muffins from the oven and wiping down the counter, she glanced out the window. The bench was empty. The bag was gone. She felt a strange ache bloom in her chest, relief tangled with sadness. He'd taken it. That meant he trusted her, a little at least. But once again, he was nowhere in sight, just vanished, like mist dissolving into the morning light. Margaret stepped closer to the window. The street outside buzzed with the beginnings of the day. A jogger passed. A man walked his dog. The bakery sign creaked slightly in the breeze. But the boy was gone. She scanned the sidewalk, half hoping she might catch a glimpse. Just the edge of his coat, the turn of his head. But there was nothing. He came, he took the bread, and he left. No words, no nod, just silence. But the bag was gone, and for now, that was enough. It became a quiet ritual, so gentle and consistent it almost felt sacred. Each morning, before the sun lifted fully above the rooftops, Margaret prepared a simple offering, sometimes a roll with butter, sometimes a slice of banana bread, once even a small square of apple pie wrapped in parchment. Always warm, always waiting in the same brown paper bag on the bench outside. She never saw him take it. Not at first. But every day, by the time the morning rush began, the bag was gone. Not a crumb left behind. The regulars started to notice, too. "Someone keeps snatching your samples," joked the mailman one morning. Margaret only smiled. Maybe they need it more than we do. After a week, she saw him again. Just a glimpse, his coat trailing as he rounded the corner, paper bag clutched close to his chest like something precious. The next day, she dared to watch from the side window, careful not to let her shadow fall across the glass. He came at 7:02, as silent and precise as ever. He looked at the bag, then up, toward the window, right at her. And then, without a word, he gave a small nod, a single, deliberate motion, not hurried, not uncertain. Acknowledgement. Gratitude. It was over in a second, but it landed in Margaret's chest like a stone in still water, rippling outward, stirring something deep. Then, as always, he turned and disappeared down the street. But this time he left her with more than an empty bench. He left her with hope. Margaret had always thought of herself as the observer, the one keeping watch over the boy from behind the glass. She noticed the way he moved, the way he lingered just long enough to take the bread, but never long enough to be caught in conversation. She studied him like a line of dough rising, quietly, patiently, waiting to become something more. But one morning, as she stepped outside with the paper bag in hand, she felt it. Eyes on her, not threatening, not fearful, just aware. She paused at the bench, her fingers tightening slightly around the warm bag. She didn't turn, didn't scan the street. But she felt it, a presence nearby, hidden, watching. She placed the bag down gently, her movements slower than usual, almost ceremonial. Then, with practiced calm, she stepped back into the bakery, heart thudding with a strange kind of reverence. From inside, she didn't go to the front window. She went to the side instead. Behind the curtain of hanging plants Walter had once insisted made the shop feel more alive. Peeking through the leaves, she scanned the street, and there he was, perched on the low wall across the road, barely visible behind the gnarled branches of a leafless tree, sat the boy, still, watching. His eyes weren't the wide, pleading kind she saw in children begging for help. They were narrowed slightly, focused, protective, as if he wasn't just accepting the food, he was measuring it, weighing her intent, guarding something fragile, a life he'd kept hidden too long to expose easily. She exhaled slowly, the understanding settling over her like flour dust on skin. He was watching her too, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. The bread she gave, the silence she kept, they weren't just kindness. They were the terms of a fragile agreement. One that said, I won't ask, you don't have to tell, but you're not alone. From across the street, he stood. No rush, no fear, just one more look at the window before he slipped away once more. The watcher had become the watched. And in that quiet exchange of trust, Margaret knew they were both beginning to understand something neither of them could say aloud. They were no longer strangers. The storm rolled in without warning, a brute of a front that turned the streets to slush and the wind into a knife. By nightfall, the town was buried in snow, the kind that silenced everything. Storefronts shuttered early, power flickered in old buildings, and the bells above Bell's bakery door stayed quiet for the first time in weeks. Margaret kept the ovens running longer than usual, if only to fill the space with warmth. She baked more than she needed, extra rolls, another pan of scones, a tray of cinnamon twists that reminded her of quieter years when Walter would insist on snow day specials. But the bench outside remained untouched. No footprints, no shadow hovering near the glass. The next morning, it was the same. Snow drifted high along the sidewalk. The paper bag she'd placed outside the day before was buried, crusted over and damp exactly where she'd left it. Untouched. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled it inside. She tried to focus on her work, on customers, on the hum of the bakery, but her eyes kept drifting to the street, to the place where he should have been. She told herself maybe he was warm somewhere, maybe someone else had stepped in. Maybe, but she didn't believe it. The second day, she tried again. Fresh bread, a thermos of hot cocoa wrapped in an old scarf. She placed it gently on the bench, heart heavy. The storm had passed but left behind an air of stillness, a kind of quiet that didn't feel right. He didn't come. Margaret stared out the window long after closing, the lights inside flickering softly against the snow. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he slept or how he survived. But she knew this. He was missing, and the space he left behind was too loud to ignore. The bakery was dark except for the single light Margaret always left on above the front counter. She was in the back, finishing the books with a mug of cold tea beside her, trying to ignore the hollow ache that had settled in her chest since the storm began. Then came the knock. Software barely audible, like someone wasn't sure they were allowed to ask for anything. She froze. The front door was already locked. It was past closing, the street still slick with ice, the town gone quiet for the night. No one should have been out. She stood slowly, heart beginning to pound, and moved toward the front. Through the frosted glass, a shadow waited, small, hunched, trembling. She flipped the lock and opened the door. There he was. The boy stood on the threshold, soaked to the bone. His coat hung from his shoulders like wet paper, hair plastered to his forehead, lips tinged with blue. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Margaret stepped aside without a word, and he entered, cautious and silent, as if he wasn't sure this moment was real. She led him to the table by the window, the one she usually reserved for early morning regulars. He sat without protest, arms folded tight around his ribs, his eyes fixed not on the pastries, but on the floor. Margaret didn't ask any questions. She brought a towel, then a blanket, then a warm bowl of soup she'd kept in the fridge for herself. He took it with shaking hands and drank slowly, like every swallow required effort. The storm had taken more out of him than just warmth. It had peeled something back. She could see it in his eyes now, not just hunger, but exhaustion, fear, grief. Still, he didn't cry. He never did. When he finished, he stood as if ready to leave, but swayed slightly. Margaret stepped forward, steadying him with a hand on his shoulder. "You'll stay," she said gently. "Just for tonight." He nodded once, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw it. Relief. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a slight easing in the set of his jaw, a tiny drop in his shoulders. He wasn't ready to speak, but he had knocked. And that was more than enough. The bakery felt different with him inside. Quieter, more fragile, as though any sudden movement might startle the moment into vanishing. Margaret moved carefully, not saying much, letting the hush between them settle like snow. He sat at the small table near the front, wrapped in the blanket she'd given him, steam from the soup curling gently into the air between them. His coat, now hanging near the heater, dripped onto the tiled floor in soft, rhythmic drops. She didn't ask questions. Not about where he'd been, not about why he hadn't come, not even about why he'd knocked. She simply stirred the pot of chicken soup and ladled it into a heavy ceramic bowl, setting it in front of him with a glass of water and a folded napkin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hands, still trembling slightly, gripped the spoon like it might be taken away. He ate slowly at first, cautious, then faster, each bite a small act of survival. Margaret pretended to busy herself at the counter, wiping already clean surfaces, adjusting trays that didn't need adjusting. But every few moments she glanced back at him. He didn't look around, didn't take in the cozy walls or the shelves lined with bread. His eyes stayed down, fixed on the bowl, focused on warmth, on sustenance, on this one safe moment. When he was done, he placed the spoon gently into the bowl, wiped his mouth with the napkin, and stood. Margaret turned, ready to offer what? She didn't know. A place to sleep, a warm cot, a real question. But he was already reaching for his coat. She didn't stop him. She walked him to the door, handing back the scarf she'd wrapped around the thermos the day before. He took it this time, met her eyes, gave her the smallest nod, more than yesterday, more than before. Then he stepped back into the cold. The door shut softly behind him. Margaret stood there for a long while, watching the fog of his breath fade into the night. He hadn't said a word, but everything about him had spoken. The next morning was gray and still, the kind of morning where even the air felt hesitant. Margaret opened the bakery like she always did, lights on, ovens warm, the smell of rising bread filling the space like memory. But her thoughts were elsewhere, hovering on the image of the boy wrapped in a blanket, silent and shivering, eating soup like it was the first real meal he'd had in days. She hadn't expected him to return. Not so soon. Maybe not ever. But just after 7, before she had even set the first tray in the display case, the bell above the door rang. He stepped in quietly. Not like a customer, not like someone who belonged. He paused just inside the door, his hands balled into fists, eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure if it was still safe. Margaret turned slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. He looked smaller in the light, paler, like whatever thread he'd been holding on to had finally started to fray. And then, barely louder than the hum of the heater, he said it. Help. It was the first word he'd spoken to her. Just one word, but it landed in the room like a stone dropped into deep water, breaking the silence, cracking the invisible wall he'd built around himself. Margaret didn't ask what he meant. She didn't press. She simply nodded and stepped toward him, reaching gently for his sleeve. Okay, she said softly. Let's figure it out. And just like that, the silence wasn't silence anymore. It was the beginning of something. He didn't say another word after help. Just turned and walked out of the bakery, expecting, trusting Margaret would follow. She did. No coat, no hesitation. Just her apron still tied and her heart pounding as she locked the bakery behind her. The early morning frost bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. The boy moved quickly but not in panic, his pace steady, his shoulders squared like someone used to emergencies, someone who knew when there wasn't time to be afraid. They retraced the path she'd memorized weeks before, through alleys, past rusted fences, around the edges of the town's forgetting. Finally, they reached the broken house. He didn't pause at the door, just pushed it open with his shoulder and led her inside. The smell hit first, dampness, dust, something sharp beneath it. Then the silence, heavy and wrong. In the far corner, beside the same cot Margaret had glimpsed once through cracked boards, the woman lay slumped awkwardly, one arm dangling off the edge, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Mom," the boy said, the word barely a whisper, more prayer than sound. Margaret rushed forward. The woman was burning up, her skin pale and slick with sweat, her lips cracked. A bottle of pills lay open nearby, untouched. The boy crouched beside her, his small hands useless on her fevered skin. "It's okay," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm calling someone." She stepped outside, her hands shaking as she dialed. Not the bakery phone, not the front desk at the clinic. She called 911. Within minutes, sirens approached, red and blue lights washing over the street. The boy stood silently in the doorway as the paramedics worked, answering only when asked, his voice small and flat. He didn't cry, just watched, like he was used to watching things fall apart. Margaret stayed beside him the whole time, her hand lightly on his back. When they lifted his mother into the ambulance, the boy moved to follow, but paused. Turned to Margaret. This time, when their eyes met, he didn't look away. She knelt so they were face to face. "She's going to get help now," she said. "And so are you." He nodded once, the tiniest crack forming in the wall he'd built around himself. And then he climbed into the ambulance, leaving behind the broken house that had held his world together for far too long. The hospital was warm and too white. Everything smelled like antiseptic and soft panic. Margaret sat in a stiff chair just outside the emergency room doors, the boy beside her, silent as ever, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't fidget. He didn't ask questions. He just waited. Eventually, the door opened and a nurse with tired eyes stepped into the hallway. "She's stable," she said gently. "Dehydration, fever, pneumonia. She's lucky you brought her in when you did." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. The boy didn't react, not visibly. Later, 2 women in navy windbreakers with laminated IDs clipped to their collars arrived. Social workers. Margaret caught only pieces of the conversation at first, phrases like child endangerment, emergency placement, and no record of school attendance. One of them took gentle notes, while the other knelt in front of the boy, her voice low and even. Margaret listened from a few feet away, her heart breaking with every answer he gave. No, he didn't know where his father was. Yes, he and his mom had lived in that house for over a year. No, they hadn't told anyone. Yes, he knew how to make soup, turn the heater on and off, check her pulse when she slept too long. She didn't want to go to the hospital, he finally said, his voice small. She said, if someone found out, they'd take me away, so I didn't tell anyone. The room went quiet. It was the kind of silence that only followed truth, the kind that left everyone standing a little heavier than before. Margaret wanted to reach for him, to explain that he'd done nothing wrong, that trying to keep his mother safe wasn't something to be punished. But she also knew this wasn't her place now. These were the people trained to handle this part, to lift the weight he'd carried alone for too long. Still, she saw the way his eyes flicked to her now and then, watching, checking, making sure she hadn't left. She hadn't. Not now, not ever, if she could help it. When the social workers asked where he wanted to wait while arrangements were sorted, he didn't answer right away. He looked at Margaret, and then he said, simply, "The bakery." The goodbye came on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. The sky was soft and pale, the way it gets when winter begins to loosen its grip. Belle's Bakery had only just opened, the scent of fresh loaves still settling into the walls, when the bell above the door chimed gently. Margaret looked up from the counter and saw him, standing there in clean clothes, his coat no longer soaked or threadbare. His hair had been cut, not short, but tidy. A social worker waited just outside, giving them a moment. He stepped inside slowly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to take up space. But this time, Margaret didn't wait behind the counter. She walked straight to him and smiled, warm and full. "I saved a roll," she said softly, reaching behind the display to pull out one wrapped in parchment, still warm. "With honey, just like you liked." He took it carefully, held it with both hands like it might fall apart. "Thank you," he said. Not whispered, spoken, real. She didn't ask questions, didn't press. She knew enough now about how he'd carried too much, hidden too well, and survived because he had no other choice. He didn't need her curiosity. He needed her to let him leave with dignity. "They've found a place for us," he said after a moment. "An apartment, with real beds. My mom, she's better. She's trying." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She nodded. "I'm glad," she said. "You deserve that." He looked around the bakery then, as if memorizing it. His eyes landed on the bench outside, where it had all begun, and then returned to her. "I used to think nobody saw me," he said quietly. "But you did." Margaret reached out and gently touched his shoulder. "Some people are too easy to miss," she said. "But not you." He gave a small, shy smile, the kind that didn't come from politeness, but from someplace real. Then, with the roll still in his hand, he turned and walked to the door. At the threshold, he paused. "Bye, Miss Margaret." She smiled. "See you, kid." He stepped into the light, the door closing softly behind him. And just like that, the boy who once stood outside with empty hands and silent eyes became part of the bakery's story forever. Not a ghost, not a shadow, but a boy, seen, fed, and finally free. It came folded in thirds, tucked neatly into a plain white envelope with no return address. Just Belle's Bakery, written on the front in careful, slightly wobbly letters. Margaret found it one morning among the bills and coupons, the kind of envelope easily overlooked. But the handwriting made her pause. She opened it behind the counter, flour still dusting her fingers. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper, the kind used in elementary schools, with thick blue lines and a red margin down the side. The handwriting was large and blocky, the letters pressed hard into the page, like each one had been written with purpose. Dear Miss Margaret, thank you for seeing me when I thought I was invisible. Thank you for the bread and the soup and the way you didn't ask me to talk when I couldn't. Mom says we're doing better. She has a caseworker and a medicine schedule taped to the fridge. I have a bed and a school and a library card. I still think about the bakery sometimes. I think about the way it smelled in the morning and how the window was always warm, even when it was cold outside. My mom says we'll visit again someday. I hope that's true. I just wanted you to know I'm okay. And I didn't forget. Your friend, Lucas. P.S. I helped my mom bake rolls last week. They didn't taste as good as yours, but I'm going to keep trying. Margaret read it once, then again, and again. Her hands trembled by the third reading, but her heart felt steadier than it had in weeks. She didn't frame the letter, didn't tape it to the front window for the town to see. Instead, she placed it gently behind the counter, tucked into the corner of the bakery's old wooden display case, where the regulars might glimpse it if they looked closely. A quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest acts, the roll, the warmth, the silent trust, can echo longer than anyone expects. Margaret read the letter a dozen times in the quiet moments between customers, her eyes always lingering on the signature. Your friend, Lucas. Lucas. The name settled over her like morning light, soft, certain, and full of meaning. For weeks he had been the boy, the shadow, the watcher, a presence, a question. Now finally he had a name that fit the quiet strength she had seen in him. Lucas. She whispered it to herself as she cleaned the counters, as she kneaded dough, as she arranged the morning display. It felt like being given a gift she hadn't asked for, but would cherish all the same. And it wasn't just the name. It was what he'd written beneath it that stayed with her the most. P.S. I helped my mom bake rolls last week. They didn't taste as good as yours, but I'm going to keep trying. I want to be a baker one day, like you. Margaret had to sit down when she read that line again, not because it overwhelmed her, but because it grounded her. It reminded her why she had ever opened this place in the first place, why she kept baking, day after day, even when the world outside felt cold and indifferent. She hadn't just fed him. She had planted something. Hope, memory, maybe even a little purpose. Lucas wanted to become a baker. And maybe, just maybe, that meant the warmth he had found inside her walls would carry forward into his own life, his own kitchen, his own future. Later that afternoon, she pulled out a small card and wrote his name carefully on it. Lucas, future baker. She tucked it beneath the letter, just behind the counter, beside the patchwork of photos, old menus, and thank you notes that lived there. A growing collage of small stories. And every time she saw it, she smiled. Because now, when people asked about the boy, she could answer. His name was Lucas, and he was going to be something wonderful. The bell above the bakery door rang, just as it always had. It was late morning, and the shelves were already half empty, proof of another good day at Bell's Bakery. Margaret, now slower on her feet and silver at the temples, stood behind the counter, arranging a tray of still warm cardamom knots. She didn't look up right away. After all these years, the rhythm of the day moved gently, predictably. But then a voice spoke. Miss Margaret? She turned, and there he was. Not a boy anymore, but a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet steadiness in his posture. His hair was shorter now, neatly trimmed, and his coat actually fit. But the eyes, those were the same. Pale, serious, and full of memory. Margaret's breath caught. For a moment the years peeled away. She saw the boy who had once stood outside her window, cold and wordless, waiting for something he wasn't sure he deserved. "Lucas," she said softly. He smiled, slow and sure. "You remembered." She stepped out from behind the counter, her knees stiff, but her heart light. "Of course I did." They stood there for a moment in the warm stillness, time stretching gently between them like dough in practiced hands. "I saved a roll for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion but steady. "Honey glazed, same as always." Lucas laughed, soft, real. "I was hoping you would." They sat together at the table by the window, the one he used to watch from the outside. He told her about culinary school, about the bakery where he now worked in Denver, about his mom, who was healthy, stable, teaching him her favorite recipes. He carried stories in his hands now, in the way he spoke about kneading, about flour, about patience. "I still remember the first roll you gave me," he said, finishing the last bite. "I didn't know food could feel like safety until then." Margaret wiped at her eyes, pretending it was just the steam from the tea. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a simple patch with embroidered letters, "Lucas Thompson, Baker's Apprentice." Below it, stitched carefully in the corner, was a phrase, "Always remembering." "I had it made," he said, offering it to her. "Thought maybe it belonged here." She took it with trembling fingers and nodded. "It does." That evening, after he left, Margaret pinned the patch beside his letter behind the counter. Beneath it, she placed a sign, written in her own familiar script. "No one leaves hungry. Ever." And when the next customer walked in, the bell chiming above them, she smiled, still carrying the weight of that first, quiet kindness, now returned full circle,